G'day, it's Grim here on Does It Matter? I wasn't intending to make another video today, but I saw a couple of articles today when I was perusing the internet and the fascinating and sometimes toxic environment that it is, and something tweaked my temper a little, and I thought I'd make a quick video about it because it's a good catalyst for and a good way to vent over some of the absolute idiocy that I see online that seems to permeate particular ideological leanings. The idea that oppression is the guiding force of history just rankles me at a core that I cannot describe succinctly and deeply enough. Oppression has been one of the greatest trials to rack humanity. People oppressing other people is a feature of life. Human malevolence and indifference to others' suffering, the othering of people into demonized groups, has been an issue throughout history, but it still isn't as pervasive and foul and horrendous and costing hundreds of millions of lives as it has. It is not the defining theme of history, not even close. It's not even remotely close to it, because civilization wasn't formed at the edge of a sword. Stuff can be taken at the edge of a sword or the point of a spear. Absolutely, I can come to your house with a weapon and I can take what I want. If you're not armed or you're not sufficiently well versed in your weapon, then I'm going to beat you and I'm going to take your weapon, take your stuff. Can I keep your things? Can I do anything with them? Can I survive the inevitable revenge? Probably not. So civilizations aren't built by the sword. In fact, they're more commonly wrecked by the sword and are forced to rebuild after the fact. Successful conquerors knew this. They won at the point of the sword or spear or gun, and then very quickly adopted as many of their conquered into their realm, empire, federation, republic, or whatever as they could. Now, I'm not going to debate on the right or wrongs of these things because they happened. It doesn't matter what we think of them now in our rarefied and leisure-ridden, pleasurable, safe climes of history. But for most of human history, fighting nature and fighting each other wasn't a choice. It was necessity. Nonetheless, what made surviving the vicissitudes of conquest, which are an inevitable feature of civilizational development, and what made surviving nature's endless assault upon any kind of complexification we were trying to do as a collective or as collectives, let alone as individuals, was it took everything we had, and that everything that we had wasn't achieved by individuals. It wasn't achieved by people doing things on their own. And it certainly wasn't achieved by people driving mobs of slaves. We now know the pyramids were not built by vast armies of slaves. That would have been impossible. I don't know if you've ever seen what disgruntled workers, the kind of work that disgruntled workers will produce. It's not very good. We all know what disgruntled public servants can be like sometimes. The quality of their work suffers. There's no way in the world that you can build a foundation of a sustainable and long-lasting civilization on the backs of slaves. I mean, the Romans were able to do it for an extensive period of time, but they had underneath that extensive slavery, you've got to remember they had a vast working class and a vast working class supported military, land-based. And they were given land if they survived their term in the military. The people were extremely productive. They had fabricae, the first factories were Roman. The first vast scriptoriums with mass production of literature Roman. And they weren't done entirely by slaves. Some of them were slaves, but many of them were trained scribes. And the fabrici were largely tradesmen. I mean, the tribunes and the working class of Rome jealously guarded their particular jobs and roles, despite the extensive use of slaves. So there was an iteration there, and it worked because they didn't have machines, they didn't have steam power, they had animal power and human power, and that was it. And some clever human powered and animal powered machines, and maybe some use of water in milling, but they didn't have the later era's technological benefits. So the interaction between slavery and or oppression, pure oppression classes, and then other classes of people was functional. It worked, and it worked for centuries. But in most cases that I've examined throughout history, societies that were purely based on conquest and purely based upon the complete and absolute oppression of others and the slavery of entire nations, it didn't work very well for them. They didn't survive very long. It wasn't sustainable. They either adapted and changed and became less reactionary, less rigid, less oppressive, or they were destroyed one way or the other, or they collapsed from within. Society just can't be maintained purely by oppression. Oppression is useful at times, and it has been exceedingly useful for the ruling classes and for those with wealth, and it still is. But to say that is the only theme, or at least the dominant theme, is nonsensical to say the very least. People need to comply. And you simply cannot make millions, let alone tens and hundreds of millions of people comply by force. That isn't even remotely possible over a length of time. Certainly people can be cowed temporarily. But to suggest that millions of people across any of the empires that have existed all complied through fear of their life and fear for their family only, and without any benefit obtained, is it's just seriously the naivety and the ignorance that drives those beliefs on both the left and even on the right, that justifies either oppression from, you're a hardcore, very far right conservatives, or you're oppression victim mongering lefties, far lefties. It's despicable. It's ignorant. It's completely betrays a complete misunderstanding of history. I'm not denying there wasn't a shitload of oppression, and there isn't still quite a bit left. What I'm saying is, it was driven by people cooperating, families, villages, communities working together. To suggest that all relationships between men and women up until 1963 or 1970 were driven by the oppression of women only, that there was no cooperation, there was no willingness on the parts of people within those families to help each other, that it wasn't driven by love as well, that it wasn't driven by concern and sacrifice by men and women for one another. To say that it was all reduced to simple power dynamics, and that that brute force power dynamic controlled 24/7 the lives, multi-generational lives of people within these civilizations, is unbelievably naive. It is ignorant beyond all measure, and it's an example of utterly failing ideologies, failing to grasp the complexity of history. People have mainly made their way through history trying to not starve, trying to be warm, trying to produce something a little better for their families, for their children, trying to produce real sustainable hope and reasons to continue against the tremendous adversities of life that still exist to this day in many cases. I feel like there's almost a competition at the moment to see between various ethnicities, various groups, ideologies, and between the genders themselves, at least on the loud and screaming fringe areas of those respective groups and ideologies, to see who suffered the most, who have committed the most crimes against one another, who are truly deserving of, 21st century pats on the back for histories that were entirely out of our control, and were out of the control of the vast majority of people that were in them as well. The idea that you can reduce the complexity of human relationships, families, tribal groups, states, provinces, townships, and nations to the simplicity of controlling the means of production, or to the simplicity of pure markets, or the simplicity of gender relationships, or the simplicity of ethnic rivalries. These are all contributing factors, important ones, but they're only some of the contributing factors and integral dynamics of these societies. There is so much we don't know. There's so much of history we don't understand and probably never will. And for people to make up these stories of history, the didactic of history, it's arrogance. It's not just ignorant. It's not just naive. It's arrogance. And there are whole philosophies that are dominating, the boardrooms of particular factories and companies and businesses and university campuses on opposing sides of the political spectrum, that are just based on this kind of cherry picking of history, this selectively choosing whatever you're butthurt about, whatever you're passionate about, whatever you feel good or bad about, and then identifying that as the thing that has shaped history. Well, I can tell you one thing: nature's shaped history a hell of a lot more than anything we've done as individuals, groups, or even nations. Nature itself. The only reason that we have a civilization is because nature, interacting with our particular genome, produced creatures that could make a civilization. And that was controlled by factors that were in motion long before we even existed as anything more than small, dumb mammals scurrying under the feet of dinosaurs. And when enough of those factors had morphed and changed, circumstances like the extinction of the dinosaurs and the stabilization of the climate in the Holocene and Anthropocene periods, even things like near extinction after Mount Toba, the fact that no other truly competitive hominids were able to resist us during our run at the planet 40,000 BC, where the cognitive revolution occurred and humans seemed to explode in terms of language and tool development and willingness to thrust ourselves across the rest of the world. All those vast changes and movements were complex, and we will not know a lot of them. No matter how much we study, we will have gaps, and those gaps are meaningful. The patchwork of history means that anything that we decide about history has to be looked at as highly questionable, as an estimation of the truth rather than an accurate depiction of it. To say that we understand from our highly biased, highly institutionalized, highly regulated, highly educated, and thus incredibly more biased than any other culture has ever existed, despite all our wide knowledge, despite our education, in fact, because of it, we have made assumptions about history that are actually not empirically supportable, and they have become dominant in many of our dominant and current ideologies. They've become dominant in popular culture on, again, both sides of the dominant sides of politics. Not that the right and left are that meaningful anymore, but those ideas are pervasive in popular culture, and they're poison. They are toxic. I know that term is somewhat abused of late, but they are toxic because they're part of the moral puritanism that has crept into both the left and the right. that troubles me. I don't like purity codes. Purity codes have a tendency to do what they always do, which is condense reality down to simplistic explanations that don't allow for more. And there's always more because our view of history and our understanding of the universe is incomplete, probably always will be, we'll always be learning, there'll always be gaps, there'll always be mysteries. And so science and empiricism and lateralism, these are the only ways to truly approach the universe, understanding that we are insufficient and inadequate in the face of reality. Nonetheless, we've got to do our best, and it's fun in the process. But ideologies have a tendency, just like theologies that preceded them, to want to map everything according to a particular central axis. And I know I've gone on about these in other videos, and you'll hear more about this as time progresses. It's not a theme that's going to go away, so I'm going to keep talking about it, because all the numpties and morons out there talking about the thrust of history being directed by either oppression or directed by means of production. And again, there's significant truth to that, but it's a lot more than that. Or directed by ethnicity or global migrations or scarcity. These are all true. They are. But the biggest influence on history, outside of nature's unending pressure, is human cooperation. Is humans fighting together to make something better. And that's something that we need to remember. That's something that we need in this era of divisive, bombastic conversation and endless adversarialism during the best times that human beings have ever had. It strikes me as when we need to remember that if we're going to meet the challenges of climate change, we're going to meet the challenges of aging populations, of automation, and how we're going to reconstruct our lives as technology inevitably changes our lives, largely for the better, but also quite destructively and disruptively as well. If we're going to meet these challenges, if we're going to expand into the universe and take our place in it, we need to grow up. We need to stop having these stupid little arguments about myths and fictions that we can't even support empirically. We need to stick to the facts as much as we can. We need to care about each other. And we need to make sure that our belief structures and ideologies are more reflective of what we know and what we don't know. Rather than trying to find hard borders around our thinking, we need to make open, porous borders that allow for more information to come in, allow for corrections within the body of knowledge itself. That's all for now. Hopefully I haven't bored you too much, and we'll talk again on Does It Matter? Ciao.